We're in John chapter 10. Making progress here. Gradually working our way through things. Notice I said gradually. But today we come to a text at the first half of chapter 10, and this text is really one of the favorites from the Gospel of John. It's one I'm sure you're very familiar with. It has been called the 23rd Psalm of the New Testament by some, which is an interesting way to think of it. But at first glance, it may seem like this is a new topic or a new piece of narrative. But in reality, as we look at this closer, we're going to see that it really is a continuation from chapter 9, from chapter 8, from chapter 7. This whole section flows together, and we'll see that chapter 10 is really closely related to what we have just observed. Now, one of the things we notice about the transition from chapter 9 to chapter 10 is there's no break. And John is very careful when he intends for there to be a break. He puts a break in there of some sort, saying Jesus went here, or they went there, or this happened, or this feast was being celebrated. And we've seen that the narrative of the gospel is interrupted by these points when there's a shift. But there's no such shift here. So that lends us to think, well, this really does seem to be connected. Secondly, if you take a look at verses 19 through 21, and we'll get to this hopefully by the end of this morning, but 19 through 21, where the place we're going to end up is the same place we've been for the last 3 chapters, where at the end of this discussion, the Jewish authorities are once again or still divided as to their opinion of who Jesus is and whether he's legitimate or not. And then also, if you take a look at verse 21, you'll see that there's a specific reference to what just happened in chapter 9, where some of the others said, "These are not the sayings of a man possessed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind?" Well, that's the miracle that we were looking at back in chapter 9. So all of these factors make us think that this really is connected. It's not a separate text. And so this is really the final piece of the discourse that Jesus has been teaching in the city of Jerusalem and in the temple area during and after the Feast of Tabernacles. And we'll recall that that's now about 6 months before the crucifixion, 5 to 6 months or something like that. So the crucifixion is drawing near. And we're going to see that as we move forward from the gospel here. Okay, so that's the connections that we see in the text. But also, we're going to see a common theme. So how does this fit in with what came earlier? Well, what we're going to see here in chapter 10 is that Jesus presents a parable of sorts, and it's about good and bad shepherding. Okay? And this is the same division that he's been talking about for 3 chapters. We called it back in chapter 7 and 8, we called it the Great Divide, because there were a group of authorities who were taking their direction, Jesus said, directly from their father, the devil. And they could not believe Jesus because they were children of their father. And that was one side of the coin. And the other side of the coin was those who were coming to place their faith in Jesus. And specifically, we see in chapter 9 that this man who was healed from his blindness becomes spiritually sighted as well as he comes to a point of faith and even to the point of worshiping the Messiah who's right there with him and in front of him. So Jesus is once again in this parable of chapter 10, he's really defining the differences between himself and all of those who have preceded him and failed their responsibility as physical leaders for the nation of Israel. Okay? And we can see at the tail end of chapter 9, verse 39, Jesus speaks of that. He says, Jesus said, "For judgment I've come into the world so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." And he's speaking of those who have religious or spiritual arrogance and believe that they see, but they really don't. And so that is who Jesus is addressing. That's the contrast that he's trying to draw between himself and them. But there is a shift beginning to occur in the gospel. And we're going to see this even more dramatically as we move into chapters 11, 12, and 13. And the shift that's starting to take place now is that we're seeing more and more the compassionate side of Jesus, the instructive side of Jesus. Jesus preparing his disciples for the fact that he will not be there come 6 months, 7 months down the road. And so he's beginning to do those final steps of preparation. And that's what we're going to see now, and that's the shift that's beginning to occur. And it's going to focus on his care for them, his shepherding of his own, his taking care of his disciples and his preparation. And this direction, that focus will become John's primary interest for the rest of the gospel as we move through this now. And we're going to see, of course, the crucifixion and the passion borne out as John observed it, but he's going to give us, as he always does, a different flavor from what the other gospels have shown us. And there's a unique, compassionate side of Jesus that we see in this gospel. So that's the shift that's beginning to take place. Here's the outline of the chapter and how it works out. Verses 1 through 6 is basically a comparison, or possibly you might call it a parable. They don't understand it. When Jesus speaks it to them, they don't understand it. They don't get it, according to verse 6. And so Jesus provides an explanation or an application. In verses 7 through 10, we see the first application when Jesus says, "I am the door," or "I am the gate," depending on which translation you're looking at. And then in verses 11 through 18, there's the second application of this same comparison story, and that's when Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd." And then in verses 19 through 21, we see the reactions to this teaching from Jesus. So, there's one more thing we need to take a look at before we get into the text of John itself. We need to take a look back, just briefly, at some of the history of how shepherding was described in spiritual terms in the Old Testament, because that's what we're building on here. So we're just going to look through some of this, but shepherding was used as this descriptive comparison for spiritual leadership and spiritual fellowship throughout the Old Testament too. We see it applied to Israel's leaders who were false shepherds and inadequate shepherds. And a good verse for this, I think I've listed it there, yes, Isaiah chapter 56. We're not going to read all of these, but I do want to read some of them. So Isaiah chapter 56, verses 9 through 12 is a description of Israel's shepherds. "Come, you beasts of the field, come and devour, you beasts of the forests. Israel's watchmen are blind." Israel's shepherds, okay, same idea. "They all lack knowledge. They are all mute dogs. They cannot bark. They can't warn the people. They don't warn the people. They lie around and dream. They love to sleep. They want to be comfortable. They're dogs with mighty appetites. They never have enough. They're selfish and self-centered, and they're focused on accumulating stuff. They are shepherds who lack understanding. They all turn to their own way. Each one seeks his own gain. Come, each one cries, let me get wine. Let's drink our fill of beer, and tomorrow will be like today or even far better." And that's a description from the mouth of Isaiah of the Old Testament leaders who were charged with the responsibility of taking care of the people of Israel, and instead they were completely self-centered and self-focused. So in certain places in the Old Testament we see God's shepherds compared to the leaders of Israel. But that's not all. We also see God portrayed as a shepherd. And the first of these verses is from Psalm 80, verse 1, where the psalmist writes, and this is a psalm of Asaph, and he says, "Hear us, O shepherd of Israel, you who lead Joseph like a flock, you who sit enthroned between the cherubim, shine forth." And so now the idea of shepherding is applied to God himself. And of course, you're familiar with the 23rd Psalm. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Makes me lie down in green pastures, leads me beside the still waters, restores my soul." All those characteristics, all those things that a shepherd does are those same things that God provides in a spiritual sense for his people. And then one more verse, again from Isaiah, in chapter 40, verses 10 and 11. "See, the sovereign Lord comes with power, and his arm rules for him. See, his reward is with him, and his recompense accompanies him." And here's the key. "He tends his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms, carries them close to his heart, and he gently leads those that have young." And so this notion of shepherding is not new when Jesus presents it in John chapter 10. But the most important verse and passage that you need to be familiar with is that of Ezekiel chapter 34. Because in this passage, there are multiple applications of this shepherding analogy. And so we see in Ezekiel 34, first of all, we see Ezekiel comparing the shepherds to Israel's leaders, just like we've read before. That's in verses 1 through 10. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I would encourage you to do it at home, please. 1 through 10 applies to Israel's leaders, the false shepherds, and Ezekiel pronounces their fate because they have failed to do a good job. And then in verses 11 through 16, we see the contrast with God shepherding the people of Israel. That one we will read. So this is what the sovereign Lord says in verse 11. "I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he's with them, so will I look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. I will bring them out from the nations and gather them from the countries, and I will bring them into their own land. I will pasture them on the mountains of Israel, in the ravines and in all the settlements in the land. I will tend them in a good pasture, and the mountain heights of Israel will be their grazing land. There they will lie down in good grazing land, and there they will feed in a rich pasture on the mountains of Israel. I myself will tend my sheep and have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. I will seek the lost and bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak, but the sleek and the strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice." Okay? But there's something that shows up here later in the chapter 34, which is a third application of this. And Ezekiel applies the idea of a shepherd to one who would come later, to a Messiah, to one who would be chosen by God. And this we see in verses 22 through 24. So let's take a look at this from Ezekiel 34. Ezekiel 34, 22. "I will save my flock, and they will no longer be plundered. I will judge between one sheep and another, and here it is, I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, who will come from the lineage of David," right? "And he will tend them. He will tend them and be their shepherd. The Lord will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken." And so we see Ezekiel prophesying the fact that one would come who would tend the sheep of Israel in a responsible and godly way. And so that is what we see coming. And indeed, then when in chapter 10 of John, Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd," guess what he's pointing to? Ezekiel 34, and how he would be fulfilling that prophecy. So now let's turn to John chapter 10. We'll take a look at those first 6 verses. And this is as close to a parable as you're going to find in John. It's interesting, the other Gospels are filled with parables. In fact, Matthew and Mark both tell us that Jesus didn't do any teaching without parables. He said he taught in parables all the time. But in John, we don't see the record of many parables, and this is about as close as you get to it. You might also think of John 15, where he says, I'm the vine, you're the branches, my Father's the gardener. So there's another sort of parabolic type teaching. But this is a special one. Verse 6 tells us that this teaching technique is many translations use a phrase called a figure of speech. It's not truly a parable. The King James translates it as a parable, but that's not the best translation of the Greek word. Probably a comparison is the better translation, and so that's the word we're going to use here. It's more of a proverb than a direct parable. It's also not an allegory. An allegory is where every specific thing in the story has a specific meaning, and you can get all twisted up in this one over that, because, for example, how can Jesus be both the gate and the shepherd in the same story? But he says, I am. But those are two applications of a concept or a principle is what is where Jesus is going with this. So it's not an allegory, okay? And this lines up with what John has done in many other places. We've talked about many parallelisms in the gospel, where we see something and it really means something spiritual. And this is carrying that teaching technique forward. So let's read verses 1 through 6 here in John chapter 10. I tell you the truth. The man who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in some other way, is a thief and a robber. The man who enters by the gate is the shepherd of his sheep. The watchman opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And when he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they'll run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but they did not understand what he was telling them. So Jesus opens this section by saying, I tell you the truth, or truly, truly, or the old translations, verily, verily. Okay? And what that's doing is it's connecting to what he's just said previously. And what he's going to do with this statement is he's going to place emphasis on the fact that there's a difference between his shepherding and the shepherding that they have been experiencing. And what did that shepherding of Israel's leaders, what did they do to the blind man after he was healed? Do you remember? They gave him the boot. They gave him the boot. So here's, on one hand, this blind man who's healed and now professes faith in Jesus. Israel's shepherds kick him out, and Jesus goes and finds him. That's the difference we're talking about here. That's the difference between God's shepherds and the shepherds of Israel. Okay, so that's it. He sets up this comparison between the true shepherds, the legitimate shepherds, and the fake or the fraudulent shepherds. There are other terms that he uses for the bad shepherd. He calls them thieves and robbers. What's that tell us? What's their goal? To steal. They're trying to steal sheep. They're trying to get control of the people. They're trying to take away from the people. They're robbing them. They're stealing them. So that's what thieves and robbers do. And we see him go ahead and describe some of the characteristics of the true shepherd versus the fake shepherd. The first thing is how they get in, how they get into the sheepfold, okay? And the true shepherd gets in how? Through the gate, through the door, under the supervision here of a watchman. That's interesting too, which I think means that God's watching this whole thing. And he's the one that's really in control of things. What about the fake shepherd? How does the fake shepherd get in? Through the window? Yeah, okay. Any other way, an unauthorized way, he breaks in. He breaks in order to get in there. Now, the door has not yet been identified. Jesus hasn't said what the door is. We know because you've read on through the text. You know what the door is or who the door is. But Jesus hasn't told them yet. The second thing that he points to as far as the characteristic of the true shepherd versus the false shepherd is the bond of trust that exists between the two of them. The true shepherd, the sheep recognize and hear and listen and heed his voice and his instruction. The shepherd knows his sheep and calls them by name, and the sheep reciprocally follow him. But the fake shepherd is unable to lead the sheep because the sheep won't follow. They do not recognize his voice and they won't pay attention to it. And so that is the difference that Jesus paints between the true shepherd and the false shepherd. And according to verse 6, he used this teaching, but they didn't understand it. And so he goes on to explain it. We get to his first application in verses 7 through 10, and we see in verse 7, first of all, that he again puts great emphasis on the fact that he's the gate of the door. Once again, he says, I tell you the truth. Truly, truly, verily, verily. So he's placing an emphasis on this. He doesn't want people to miss this. When he says, I am the gate. This should remind us of John 14:6. I am what? The way, the truth, and the life. It's not an option. There is one way in here, and it's the door, it's the gate, and it's Jesus. It's not these other ways that people have been climbing in and out. These shepherds putting themselves in where they can influence the people and dominate them, but not authorized by the watchman. They're not doing it in his way. Okay? So this is Jesus' culmination of his defense to be God's true Messiah. He says, I am the way, I am the door. I am the door. He's been building to this since chapter 7, and he wants to get across the point that he is really who he claims to be, his identity. He is God's shepherd, but he is also the one who has the legitimate access to God's sheep and to God's people. He is the one who has that legitimate access, regardless of what other shepherds are saying. Okay? Yeah, that was verse 7. I am the door. Verse 8. He contrasts himself with everybody who came before him. I guess I should read this. I intended to read it, and I forgot it. We should read 7 through 11. Jesus said again, I tell you the truth, I am the gate for the sheep. All whoever came before me were thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. He will come in, go out, and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. In verse 8, he presents himself as a contrast to all who came before me, his predecessors. And that's those leaders of Israel that we read about from the Old Testament prophecies of Isaiah and Ezekiel, those leaders who had failed to continue to honor God's principles of shepherding. Now, Psalm 77, verse 20, gives us an interesting insight into what God expected of his shepherds. And I want to take a look at that. Psalm 77, 20. It's a very simple verse, but listen to what it says. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. That was the intention, was that God would be the leader and the shepherd of his people. His authorized servants like Moses and Aaron were those who did it God's way. And they were the ones who were legitimate. But the other leaders who came and subverted God's purpose, they did it differently. They did it selfishly. They did it for themselves. And so God's legitimate leaders always pointed to a future Messiah. Remember, that was part of what Moses and Aaron taught. They said, there will be a prophet who will come after me who is like me. That's what Moses said back in Deuteronomy 18. And there will be a prophet who comes. And so that prophet will be the Christ. That prophet will be the Messiah. And the Old Testament leaders, when Jesus says here, everybody who came before me, he's talking about those leaders who perverted God's role for themselves and instead just did a power grab, basically. Okay? Okay, so that's verse 8. He's contrasted to his predecessors. And then in verse 9, he links protection to himself as the shepherd and calls that salvation. Notice that. Protecting the sheep is keeping them safe. Keeping one safe is salvation. Okay? So Jesus links himself to the salvation of the sheep. The sheep will be kept safe under my watch. And so they will be able to come in and go out. This was an expression of daily living. They will carry out their lives under my shepherding. And that's what Jesus is telling them in verse 9. Verse 10, we have another contrast where the thief's goal is stated to be what? To steal, kill, and destroy. To take. Even to take life. Okay, but to take. And that was what the thief comes. What does Jesus come to do? He comes to bring life. And that's the contrast. This verse gets pulled out of context all the time. But the critical thing to understand about it is it's this contrast that he's painting. He's painting the contrast between the motivation of God's earlier shepherds and his failed shepherds versus that of his Messiah, his chosen servant, who would come that they might have life and have it to the full. Go ahead, Lamar.
It doesn't mean that he came so that we can get everything we want from him?
I don't think so. He didn't get it himself. Okay. So, one other thing I want to point out here while we're here is, remember how I've told you several times, everything in the gospel you get out of the prologue? This is John 1, verse 4. Listen to it. Listen to what it says. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. Just that simple. There it is. That's what he lays out for us. And think about where he's going next in chapter 11. Where are we going to be in chapter 11? Hint, the town of Bethany. The death of Lazarus. I came to bring life. You see how this is all sewn together? It's amazing. Excuse me. Okay. The second application of this parable, then, we come across in verses 11 through 18. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen, and I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me. I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. And so Jesus extends his claim now, where he has already said, I'm the door or the gate. Now he says, I am that good shepherd. I am the good shepherd. And the emphasis is on the words I and good. He is not like the other shepherds, the shepherds of Israel. In fact, he says it twice in verse 11 and again in verse 14. And this is the section where you can easily think of this as a parallel to Psalm 23 and the New Testament version of Psalm 23 and how God leads his people in Psalms and how Jesus will provide that same type of shepherding here in John. And what Jesus does is he goes ahead and he gives us some reasons that he is the good shepherd and justifies that claim. The first reason is in verses 11 through 13, where he says, I am willing to risk my life for the sheep. These other shepherds, not so much. I am different in that regard. And he describes how far he was willing to go. And remember that this is not just a theoretical thing. Jesus knows full well that his day is less than 6 months in the future, that this is going to happen, and he will give his life for the sheep. Now, for a shepherd of Israel, this was above and beyond the normal call of duty. What was expected of a shepherd is if they were under attack, whether it was from other people or whether it was under wild animals or whatever, if there was an attack on the sheep, the shepherd was expected to be there with the sheep, but he did not have to risk his own life to save the life of the sheep. We can see that in some of the legal things that took place back in the day. When there would be disputes about whether the shepherd had met his responsibilities and things. It was apparently clear that the shepherds did not have to put their life on the line. But Jesus says, I will put my life on the line. And the contrast, of course, is to the hired servant, to the hired shepherd, who is only interested in getting their paycheck or their meal or whatever they're getting out of the deal. They're not interested in the welfare of the sheep or the individual nourishment and the well-being of the sheep particularly. And this paints a picture of Israel's shepherds as being just flat-out imposters, fakes. They cared only for themselves. Notice carefully verse 13. The man runs away because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. That's how he's describing Israel's leaders. The second characteristic of the good shepherd is the intimacy that exists between the sheep and their shepherd. And Jesus describes this reciprocal relationship. It goes both ways. It doesn't just flow downhill from Jesus to us. It flows downhill from Jesus to his sheep, but also uphill from the sheep to their shepherd. And notice what he says. First of all, he says that his shepherd knows his sheep. The shepherd knows his sheep. God adopts people into his fellowship, into his company. He chooses them as his own. He knows them personally. He cares about their lives. He protects them. He provides for them. And he calls them into his service, into his working field. But the other direction that this flows is that the sheep know their shepherd. The people know him and trust him as their friend and as their God both. Those individuals have been called and to be part of his family. And so they respond in faith and trust and obedience to that shepherd who takes care of them. And that is the relationship that we see. And interestingly enough, John points out this is the same type of relationship that exists between the Father and the Son. Do you see that in verse 15? Just as the Father knows me and I know the Father. So they are the example for how we relate to Jesus. So things flow downhill from God to Jesus. Things flow downhill from Jesus to his sheep, but they also flow uphill from the sheep to the shepherd, and then from the shepherd up to the Father. It's a beautiful, beautiful picture, isn't it? Okay, and then in verses 16 through 18, we see these prophecies begin to be disclosed. And he gives some prophecies, but they're in sheep and in shepherd terminology instead. So that's the way we need to look at it. First of all, in verse 16, he says this flock is going to expand. And indeed, it's going to expand in ways that they didn't expect or like. But he says, I have other sheep, and they will become part of this flock. And of course, what's that referring to? The Gentile world, being brought into a relationship with God. Exactly. And notice that he even says eventually things will be equal between them. A Jew could not stomach that. Did you notice? They will, I must bring them also, they too will listen to my voice. There will be one flock and one shepherd. They will be the same, period. And so that was really, really difficult for the Jews to understand. And this was not what the Jewish nation was expecting. Remember, just a few chapters back, they were ready to make Jesus their king.
Well, they had a lock on God in their mind.
That's right. That's right. They were sole possessors of God and his promises. Okay, but that's not all that Jesus foresees coming. He also speaks in verses 17, 18 that he will both lay his life down and he will take it up again. And so he makes it clear that the sacrifice that he is going to render on the cross is not that is accomplished by his enemies. Jesus says, it's my doing that this is happening. Get behind me, because this is God's purpose. This is what the Father wants. This is what the Father expects. And so he makes it clear that his sacrifice is his own decision and action. His reason for doing that is in verse 18, because he received that command from his Father. That is why he will do it, and his sacrifice is going to be done by him and not to him. All right?
So important. I never really thought about it that way before.
Yeah. Yeah, this is all Jesus doing. And it's easy to read this gospel and think, well, it's his enemies who are winning all the way along here. It's Satan who's winning this thing. But no, Jesus says no. The only reason this is moving forward is because I will that it happen. And the only reason I will that it happen is because Father demands it, Father expects it. And so next we come to the reaction. Oh, I'm sorry. Somebody say something? Okay, I guess not. Sorry. So now we come to the tail end of this section, verses 19 through 21, and this is going to leave us, as I said earlier, in a familiar place. We've read this before. Go ahead, Lamar.
Make a point, because I think if you're explaining this to someone that's a non-believer, they're going to see the cross as a failure. But when you show them what Jesus is saying, you see the victory, that was the plan and that was the purpose, and he's telling them way ahead of time, this is the way this is going to go down, which I think makes the cross even more powerful.
And I think one of the details that John has provided us in several places here is the fact that these guys intended to kill Jesus, and they tried to kill Jesus several times. But John said it didn't happen because his time had not yet come. What that's telling us is that as John looks back at this, he can see clearly that Jesus is the one who's in control of this whole situation. And they've tried to pick up stones. They're going to do it again at the end of the chapter. This is in verse 39. Once again, they tried to seize him, but he escaped their grasp. This happens time after time after time. And you cannot read the text without understanding who's really in control. But you have to look for it. You have to watch it. You have to take it apart. Because otherwise, it's very easy in a superficial read to think, well, they won that round of the boxing match, but Jesus just got a TKO in the end, and that's how he came. No, Jesus was in control of the fight from beginning to end, all 15 rounds. That's right. Okay, so here we are in verses 19 through 21. At these words, the Jews were again divided. We've seen that before. Many of them said, he's demon-possessed and raving mad. Why listen to him? But others said, these are not the sayings of a man possessed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind? Referring back to what they had just witnessed back in chapter 9. So this is a familiar tune. We've got a group of the Jews who are saying that, well, he's demons possessed, he's crazy. And then we've got another group of Jews who are saying, wait a minute, That doesn't sound quite like that kind of a person. I've seen and heard that person. This doesn't seem like that. And how do you explain the miracle? We go back to the fact that John uses these miracles as signs. Signs that point to spiritual realities and spiritual truth.
Not only that, at this point, Jesus doesn't have to argue. They're arguing for him.
That's right.
They said, look at this. You can't be a demon and do these things.
That's right. Some of the people get it. Some of the people don't.
Oh, yeah.
And what else is new, right?
Yeah.
What else is new? So this closes this section of teaching. These were the teachings, once again, starting back in chapter 7, that occurred during and immediately after the Feast of Tabernacles. During these teachings, Jesus has made the following claims. I will provide streams of living water. I will bring light to the entire world. I am God's chosen one through whom, if you want to have a relationship with him, the only way is through me. I'm the gate. I'm the door. I'm the way in. And then he is the true and good shepherd. He's the one who does take care of his people. Some of the Jews hear that voice and those calls. They did it we saw that in chapter 7. We saw it in chapter 8. We saw it in chapter 9. We see it again in chapter 10. Some people heed that, others do not. But the result is there's this deep division and this deep schism that's occurred within the Jewish nation about who Jesus really is. Now, next week, we're going to have one more of these confrontational episodes as we look at the second half of chapter 10. But then after that, Jesus will turn his attention to the nurturing, the care, and building the trust and the steadfastness and the faithfulness within his own disciples. And once again, we're going to see this unique picture presented to us of how Jesus takes care of his own. It's a beautiful thing. So I'd encourage you to read Ezekiel 34 and then take a look at this first half of chapter 10 and sort of put those two things next to each other and understand what God expected of his shepherds and how Jesus is the true shepherd. God is good. See you next